So let's jump in to our schooling of the spirit or mental body. Now, in this particular phase of the training, Franz Bardon wants to draw a connection between the awareness built in step 6 and actively using that awareness. So the awareness we built in step 6 was of the workings of the mind, subtle workings of the mind, relationships of willpower, discernment, cohesion, right, or attachment, and of course consciousness more in a pervasive type of sense, that deep awareness. Now in this step, in step 7, we take those awarenesses of the subtle workings of the mind and we start to look at how we can use the exercises worked on up to this point to manage imbalances. So just like we worked with magical equilibrium or equanimity through harmonization of the astral elements, we want to also be able to fine-tune the workings of the mental elements. And that's one way to look at these particular functions of, once again, will to the fire, discernment to the air, cohesion to the water, and consciousness to the earth. Okay, so the fire element is to light. And if it's to light, then it is to sight. So if we are deficient in the fire element or in a willpower, right, the ability of the mind to continue, right, to persevere, to hold on to something, to focus, right, to move forward, that tenacity of the mind. If we are lacking in that department, then this is where Franz Bardon suggests doing more imagery-based visualization. So when you're doing your mental training exercises, working the gate of sight, right? Now, this can be done through both an observational capacity as well as a concentration capacity, right? So you can observe the phenomena of the eye gate, and you can do this with many degrees of subtlety. Okay, now let's say you are lacking in the intellectual faculties of the mind, discernment, intellectual speed and function. This is to the air element, and this relates through Bardon's work to the ear, to the acoustic explorations and meditations. So if you want to strengthen that, you would then visualize the sound gate, envision what the ear would bring in, how things sound, and or the awareness side of it, listening. So if you're going to listen, you have, same with sight, same with the other senses, you have all the macro stimulus that comes in, right? We have all of these big aspects, big stimulus that comes in that are obvious to perceive. Then when we listen more deeply, we start to notice or see more deeply, or any of the senses, we start to notice more subtle stimulus. So one way to really begin building this potential is to listen to the silence. When you have observed everything that you can hear, or that you can see, or that you can feel, right, to the astral, to the feeling gate, feelings, emotions, intuition. When you get to the feeling gate, when you've maxed out what you can feel, what you can hear, what you can see, what you can, of course, taste and smell, then you start to apply your senses to what you can't. So you begin to listen to the silence. You listen to the space between the big stimulus, the big expressions of stimulus, right? And so you can look at this, say, from a musical standpoint, as listening to the space between the notes. Stimulus being the notes, right? That which is struck and resonating. And all the sense gates, as far as we can tell, seem to work through the sense of touch, which is why developing the feeling gate can have such a powerful effect. To the degree where many teachers and systems will demonize the use of the other sense gates. However, there is value in all of them. So, this particular section of the book looks at tinkering with in a way that we can harmonize these faculties of mind, right, through the exercises. Okay? Now, personally, I have found that each of the sense gates is open to all of those elements of mental function. Right? So you can develop your will, your discernment and intellectual potential, your cohesive nature, the ability to attach and nourish all those things that are of the water element, and of course the consciousness aspect. This can be worked through in each of the sense gates. So I find this, I understand, of course, there might be an easier tendency towards working the will with the mind through the eye gate, through those types of meditative explorations. There might be an easier potential to touch into the intellectual components through working the ear gate. However, anyone who's played complex musical pieces, you develop a lot of concentration through listening. You develop a lot of will through listening, right? You can develop a lot of will through feeling, and you can develop a lot of will through the expansiveness of mind that comes through the consciousness earth element exploration. All of it reticulates and spins through itself. So rather than get stuck on, okay, I want more willpower, I'll do eye-based visualization exercises, right? You can, of course, do the eye-based visualization exercises, but also practice your will through all of the sense gates. Practice your discernment and the awakening of the intelligent functions through all of the sense gates, right? And of course, through each of the elements, right? This will give you a lot more richness when it comes to this harmonization of mental function and these attributes of the mind. And as you go deeper into your meditations, you'll start to notice this, okay? So you, of course, have the creative process that we're developing through active, what we might call active meditations. And you then have the awareness, the mindfulness type of function that's being developed through the observational side of the meditations. Okay, so you can do this externally and internally through the observational side. You can be, say, listen to whatever bird song you can hear, and then you'll find that you can't hear anymore. So you listen to the silence, listen to the space between the bird song, and you'll find that there's more song in there. There's more that you can hear. And then suddenly there's nothing left, but then there's space within and in between and underneath that, and you find more. And through this expansive awareness of, say, just the ear gate, you can develop incredible intuitive capabilities, which are, according to Bardon, due to the feeling. But by expanding through, say, the ear gate, you also find that you feel the vibration of the bird song, just as you feel the vibration of light, right? And if you want to find some differentiation there, the difference between sun at midday and sun as it's going over the horizon, it's sunrise or sunset, at dawn or dusk. Well, those are pretty different feeling capacities. You can smell, but you can also feel what you're smelling. You can taste, you can also feel what you're tasting. There's all these different qualities embedded in each of the senses. And there's a type of vibration. The ear and the eye are relatively easy to understand the touch-based side of the observation. Okay? So once again, we're really working the harmony here, the harmony of the mental function of these attributes of mind. And if we are noticing deficiencies, we have some potentials here, things that we can explore to help harmonize the workings of these mental attributes. Okay? Harmony, harmony, harmony. This is magical equilibrium or equanimity at many layers of the vibrational scale. We often will, in Bardon's work, will get stuck on the emotional side of things as being the only thing that we need to harmonize, that we need to find equanimity within and ultimately experience a deep silence through. Okay, so at each layer of subtlety, there's more equanimity to be discovered. And this is something that we can progress with. Okay, so the thing that we want to talk here as well about is the earth element, which is to consciousness, and this one can be a little bit confusing. The method given for working the consciousness side of the mental attributes is through expansiveness of consciousness and expansiveness of mind. And this is a byproduct of all of the exercises that you end up doing, and has a direct and immediate through path to the Akasha. So as we start to expand the perceptions of the senses, and we find further and further recesses of stillness, quiet, equanimity, silence, and the stimulus that exists within, this opens up the expansiveness of consciousness and ultimately leads to a relationship and recognition of omnipresence a little bit later on in the book here. So there's a lot to be learned through the exploration of the sense gates. They are not to be demonized. None of them are to be demonized. There is always the active potential when it comes to the fabricatory or fabrication process through the active meditations, right? And this can be done to build energy, like all kinds of potentials here within the active side of it, the envisioning side, where you're bringing together the full brunt of the creative potential from an energetic standpoint, right? And then of course there's vast potentials on the awareness side of it and the dissolution side of it. As we build our ability to observe the creative process, which we've discussed before, we also develop our ability to observe that creative process when it's functioning in the absence of our volition, which gives us agency to work the release or the defabrication process, which is the surrender aspect of this. Okay, so everything's always working hand in hand. Harmony, equanimity, equilibrium at many layers of the vibrational scale. Work on the individual exercises in terms of the sense gates in relation to the specified elements, right, that Bardon gives in the book here. And also we work on the a more whole view of each of the attributes of mind as being developed and worked on within each of the sense gate meditations and observational explorations. All right, let's move on now to the schooling of the soul. Okay, let's move on now to the schooling of the soul. So in this next phase, we start looking at the clair senses. So that would be clairvoyance to the eyes, to spiritual sight, clairaudience to spiritual hearing, clairsentience to spiritual feeling, clairalliance to spiritual smell and scent, and clairgustinance to spiritual taste. Okay, so what this refers to is the ability to perceive beyond the physical, beyond the norm. Okay, now in the beginning, a big part of what we're picking up is subtle physical cues, more and more subtle physical cues. But over time, we start to pick up on energetic aberrations as well, energetic stimulus. So the easiest way to begin working on this, I found, is not what Bardon recommends. He has a way of isolating every exercise and isolating everything from everything else. And I find that in practitioners who are quite devoted to Bardon's work, that isolated mindset makes it very, very difficult to progress. Okay, it does take a degree of evolution to be able to expand the perspective to a point where you can embrace a less isolated path forward, essentially, okay? So the easiest in, of course, would be to start with life force. And the more acquainted you become and familiar you become with perceiving life force, just through your day-to-day activity, you'll start to see the life force, hear and feel the life force, smell and taste through the medium. That's a very important word here, through the medium of the life force. Okay? And this is where it starts. And as you progress up the vibrational scale, merging each scent gate with each evolution of your progression up that scale, you will find that you start to see, hear, feel, taste, smell in relation to the astral planes, astral energies, and mental and beyond. So there's a lot of very innate natural progression that can occur here simply through developing your awareness of different substrates of energy and developing them and working them consciously to the point where can be both conscious and subconscious. Okay, so this happens on its own. Now, where Bardon jumps in here is when you really want to accentuate these particular skills and awarenesses. So before we dive into his specific instructions and our little walkthrough of that, it's important that we look at what's really happening here. How have we developed this? So through this, through the clair experiences, we are allowing to form through the sense gates higher type of correspondence to higher spiritual input. Okay, and when we were up to this point working on our visualization exercises, your envisioning exercises through each of the sense gates, from the creative process, we were practicing our ability to form image, to form sound, to form feeling, to form smell, to form taste, right? And through all of that practice, we have now built very refined doorways and pathways for this to manifest through those practices or through those potentials that we built. So we built the potential for refined image coming through, for all of the sense gates, refined sensory experience to form in the mind. And now, through the almost like listening exercises in a sense, we are allowing those pathways to be used, or those pathways are going to be used. So this has a lot of value when it comes to higher spiritual work, and when it comes to different types of lessons and evolutions and growth permeating through. Okay, now, as it's been mentioned many times, there is usually two camps. There is the camp that deifies the destructive cycle and camps that deify the creative cycle. We want to be aware of and free from and able to use both. This allows for a balanced growth. Now, everybody has different senses that they're more prone to higher function, right? So we all have one sense gate that from a spiritual standpoint might function more efficiently. So for many people, this would be the clairsentient gate, the sense of feeling and intuition, etc. For others, it might be the visions and the sense of sight. And for others, it might be voices and the experiences of entities and other types of things speaking to them, or chanting, for example. So these are things to keep in mind. Now, if we are running a deficit on several of these, or one or two or whatever, then Bardon gives us some tools to cultivate those particular clair sense experiences. Okay, so the instructions are pretty straightforward with working the eye gate, and the clairvoyance is, of course, you have your fluid condensers in each of the exercises he gives here. And these are a means of retaining and amplifying and directing the energy that we will build in the meditations into the gate, right? Also, the use of relaxing type of substances, say with the chamomile, right, has that releasing effect. There can be a lot of strain that people put into the location of the sense gate that they're working on, and you can create a lot of strain, and it's not necessarily the best thing. We want to tap into these perceptions in a relaxed, natural way, and not with a lot of force and strain. So that's one of the other unmentioned values of the fluid condensers there. Okay, so essentially with the clairvoyance, we load the eyes with light and with the knowing that we can see past, present, future, that the sense of sight is all penetrating and expansive. So there's an Akashic quality to this. Okay, and the idea is that you start to be able to see more clearly into the past, see more clearly into the present, and you start to get inklings of sight into the future. And this expresses through possible futures, your perceptions of karma, of cause and effect, start to expand in the amount of time, the duration of time that you start to see these causational arcs acting out, to the point where you start seeing them before your birth and much further than this present moment into the future. And this starts to give us a little bit of this second sight, this deeper spiritual sight. Now, of course, there's much more here. You start to see into the subtleties of students or people around you. You might start to see into the past of the environment that you're in, right? Maybe it was a war zone at one point, right? Or a slaughter ground or a burial ground or whatever. And you might start to pick some of that up through the eye gate as you start working on this. So, of course, the same type of expression and perceptions apply through the ears. You might walk into what used to be a holy area and start hearing chanting. Or maybe someone gives you transmission of a frequency and you start hearing the chants that may have come with that frequency. Maybe it's a known holy site. It could be an unknown holy site. But the idea is that you start getting information and input from a spiritual sense through the ear gate. Now, Bardon uses the akasha when it comes to the clairaudience along with the air element, as he uses light and the fire element to the clairvoyance. He uses the air element to the clairaudience and akasha. Now, it's funny because reading through this, I hadn't integrated this little piece here that I'm about to mention. I'd sort of looked at it as my own intuition, but there we go. He mentions it here. So that is that the ether is the akasha, essentially the akasha of the physical, of the dense, right? And so he uses this here in relation to clairaudience and radio type waves and signals from the antenna type of perspective, right? And I believe it was Nicholas Tesla who did some interesting work when it came to the ether and antenna that could pick up particular frequency and electromagnetic charge and electric, like just a straight up electric energy through a simple type of antenna that would tap him into that. So I find that the akasha is a wonderful bridge, or the ether is a wonderful bridge for all of the clair experiences, not kept only for clairaudience, but Bardon does apply it specifically for the clairaudience. And then the last one he mentions is the clairsentient gate, and of course he applies the water element to that. Now, as you start applying the akasha, what you perceive will be that much more refined, right? You start to really pull apart space and pull apart time. And so you can have some very, very interesting effects. Now, the air element, from some perspectives, is the closest to the akasha. From other perspectives, the fire element could be the closest to the akasha, as both are quite devoid of form, right? And shape, the air element being probably the most devoid of form, whereas fire element tends to have or requires some type of shape, right? For the most part. This all changes when you start getting into more like plasmic type stuff, subatomic type stuff, and then things get weirder. But let's continue here. When you start to awaken these clair senses, one thing that happens is we often become, how could we put it, like perhaps a little too sure in the reality of what we're perceiving, right? We want to, of course, have faith in the accuracy of our perceptions, but we also want to make sure that we are not deluding ourselves. And that is where the cleanliness of the development of the practicer, the magician, the initiate, really comes into play. We really want to make sure that we have cleansed ourselves of attachment to our perceptions. Okay, if we have not, then there will be a lot of pride that becomes embedded into the perception. And the accuracy can definitely start to become questionable. So most people who start to develop these skills will need to look at this side of the personality and really do the work there, so that we aren't having a very faint actual clair recognition, right? And then allowing the mind to spin a bunch of stories around the actual perception. Okay, so that becomes very, very important with this, because we can do a lot of damage to other people by how we view them. Remembering that we need to see that which we wish to be in the world. So how you see someone makes a big difference. And if what you are seeing is based off your own egoistic, even if subtle, just, cascades of thought, etc., well, that might be an issue. Okay, so once these skills do start presenting themselves, there is a tendency to want to speak them. Hey, this is what I observed. Hey, is this blah, blah, blah. And the value in this is that you can get immediate feedback as to the efficacy of what it is that you're perceiving. However, it can also be like pretty rude. So I remember when my own deeper sight started to kick in, and I was seeing things that like people wouldn't want to know that they were sharing that with people. And I just thought it was cool. And so, I remember working with one woman, and she came for a private session. I was like, oh, like, you're scared. What's going on? Like, you're scared today. And she just, I started crying. And to me, it was just, oh, this is as obvious as if you were standing on one leg hopping. And I went, hey, why are you standing on one leg hopping? It can become incredibly obvious what's happening beneath the surface for other people. So we want to act with some respect here and observe silence, right? And allow the awareness to perhaps influence more useful action that doesn't involve, just sort of stripping back people's armor, because, so that's not necessarily good for growth, right? We want comfortable growth and the ease of expansiveness, right? That liberative ease. It's very hard to move towards liberative ease when our own protective layers are suddenly not there, and then we try to find other things to hide behind, and the contraction happens, right? So we want to make sure that we have our ethics on board here, and that we aren't essentially being invasive and rude with this. So the development of how we view people matters. When information and insight does come through as we cultivate our perceptions, we want to make sure that we act in a way that is conducive to that person and that environment's best positive outcome. Okay, now likely in the beginning, most people are going to be a little bit more open about what they're perceiving because it's cool. It's new, it's novel, it's so exciting. So be aware of that kind of stuff. Now, the intuition will present subtle information through the different sense gates. So maybe you're walking in the woods and you get an image that crosses, your clairvoyant sense gate of like a cougar, and you walk another 100 meters and you see a cougar in a tree, right? This is like at the physical level that some of this stuff presents. Maybe you hear the slithering or the rattle of a rattlesnake, and round the bend there's a rattlesnake. So maybe these are how things start to present in the beginning. There's vast potentials when it comes to plants and medical and edible type of use cases and ways you could start to explore this. Okay, so as you progress more and more on your spiritual path, it's through the clair gates that higher lessons, entities, and evolutions will start to make themselves known to you and communicate, right? And so we want to be as clear a conduit as possible for that stuff to make its way through. Okay, now one more thing when it comes to cultivating the sense gates to a higher degree. We've talked about the accuracy, we've talked about maybe observing silence more than discussing things straight up with people. One more thing that's really important that we take into consideration is the arising of a desire and the reasons which we might want to have or develop these second sight type of skills. So, like in the martial arts, most people who get into martial arts in a real serious way had environmental circumstances in life that robbed us of our freedom, of our volition, where we felt imposed upon. And so we try to find ways to manipulate the environment around us. And many people who've gone through quite traumatic experiences, especially in their youth, will develop a hypersensitivity to environmental stimulus. And the idea is that the further back in time we can be aware of the wave that's going to arise and then crash down, the easier it can be for us to mediate that experience, right? So that's something to keep in mind here. A lot of us want to develop in the beginning these skills so that we can have a sense of control of the environment, so that we can see further back in the causational web, at least in the immediate sense, and be prepared and know what's coming. If we can know what's coming, that means we can be a little safer. And so this is very, very common, that this little, personality quirk can be embedded in the training of these. So be aware of this, and really, once again, do your cleaning. There's a lot of personal development work that can be done through the Claire Gate exercises. Okay, so lots of fun. Once again, lots of fun to be had with these. The expressions are just infinite in terms of how you can work on these. Your own creativity will bestow upon you a whole milieu of exercises and ways of exploring this. Okay, so let's move on to the training of the physical body here, which I believe is in relation to elementaries. One more important thing that needs to be discussed here in relation to sentience, clairsentience, is the location of sentience. So when we describe something as having become sentient, typically we're talking about it having woken up or developed a consciousness. Now, astrally, we all have different locations in the body from which we view the world, from which we perceive the world. And I believe we discussed this briefly in one of the earlier steps in reference to transfer of consciousness. And when we start exploring the astral body, we find that different elements, as they're fluxing, will bring the awareness through a certain part of the body. So Bardon mentions that the fire element, if that is predominant, then the location of sentience will be through the head. If the air element is predominant, then the location of sentience will be through the heart. If the water element is dominant, the location of sentience will be through the solar plexus. And if the earth element is dominant, I believe he mentions the thighs and the hands. Now, these specifics don't seem to be relatable to everybody. So instead, what I find to be most valuable here is to look at oneself, to really, really develop your own awareness of from where you are perceiving stimulus and the world now in whatever moment you happen to be working this awareness. And you'll find habitual views or habitual expressions of awareness, habitual locations of awareness. You might find that certain types of situations will alter the dominant element enough that the location of awareness changes. So one way I used to work on this was in relationship to Tai Chi, and I would often try to perceive the world from the lower dantian. What is the world as existing from the lower dantian? You could apply this to any of the chakras. You could apply this to any of the joint centers, which are further chakras and energy wheels, wheels in a multi-dimensional sense. And you can apply this really all across the board by using the skill of transfer of consciousness. So cultivating your clairsentience and really working that feeling quality will allow you to fine-tune not just your awareness of from where you are viewing the world, but also give you freedom. And this will allow you to notice the difference when you are viewing the world from a higher spiritual space and when you're viewing the world around you, including yourself, from a coarser, more individualistic space. So there's lots and lots to be learned from this exploration, and it's definitely worth putting some time into. Now, not all of these exercises need to be done in a rigid manner in terms of I'm going to practice this thing for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour or a week or a year or whatever. A lot of these exercises can be done with a general awareness in the background in relation to other exercises or even in more of a daily life situation. Now, the less chaotic the daily life situation is, the easier it will be to stay in a deeper state of meditation throughout all of your day, which will accentuate and catalyze the speed with which you can learn all of this stuff. So we always have specific practice and then general practice through awareness that we apply in day-to-day activities. Okay, so from where are you viewing the world? Okay, so the last part of this little section on clairvoyance and the spiritual sensory communication skill sets is to do with psychedelics and drug use. So Bardon warns against this, and the reason given, well, there's a few, but a big one is it robs you of will. We'll break this down a little bit so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on here. Now, personally, I've done no psychedelics in my life. There's been no draw to it, really. And when I've discussed with friends who have done a lot of psychedelics, and I share with them some of the stuff that I experience with the training that I do, they'll often be like, oh yeah, I think I experienced something similar when I do, one guy said like 10 grams of psilocybin, which is a lot. But anyway, point being that you don't necessarily have to take drugs to have these experiences. Now, that being said, the perception of spiritual experience, this is not something that we want to deify, because it will rob us of spiritual growth over time, because we will develop an attachment and an adherence to certain types of experience. So let's talk a little bit more about the psychedelics. How they tend to work from a metaphysical standpoint is that they will tap into the protective Qi, essentially, the mental matrix that binds the mental body and substrate into the astral and vital function, right? So this creates balance, right? It gives us the balance that we have, and it gives us a cohesion, right? That's what stops us from falling over, right? If we're falling, that substance gets pulled, that mental matrix that gets pulled, and then boom, it snaps into place, and that return, boom, snaps us back into balance. So when one of the big values that the drug use has is in unwinding or unbinding that substance. So it essentially robs us of our protective mechanism and forces the opening to occur, the release of the adherence between mind and the astral, vital, physical nature, right? And so this is very valuable from a therapeutic standpoint because it allows people to see beyond their identification with their story and their life and their habits and their choices and their actions and their thoughts and their feelings and etc., right? So there's a lot of value in this. However, in more traditional settings, the use of drugs was a sledgehammer effect, and it was used in the beginning to allow people who were beginners to open. This is from the stories I've heard from people who are doing engaged in very unknown and very, very ancient systems. And in such systems, the drugs were used for beginners to hold them open, to hold them, force a state of release so that they could participate in long ceremonies that might last even multiple days, right? So these substances would keep them open and in a state of non-adherence to their past so that new information could come through and they can realign to higher spiritual paths, right? So the substance would keep them in some cases awake as well as open, right, for long durations of time. Now, in those systems, if you don't need the drug, if you have the skill to sustain that openness, that dissolution of the protective mechanism, and of course the concentration through training to stay focused and awake, they're overjoyed to not give you the drugs. They don't want to give you the drugs. It's just a tool. So that's one way of looking at that kind of stuff, okay? Now, what happens when you, in the absence of your own will, remove your protective mechanisms, right? And weaken that mental matrix? Well, one of the things that happens that I've noticed and that has been corroborated by other practitioners, people who do like a lot of, say, ayahuasca, 30 ceremonies, 40 ceremonies, like a lot, often have very weak bodies, weak connective tissue, very malleable mind, kind of wavy, right? It's harder to focus, and this is because the act of reintegration, right, gets robbed from the person. And when I say reintegration, I'm not talking about psychological guidance after a ceremony. This is the thing that's missing after most modern ceremonies, if not, well, most would be people go, they get torn open by the drug, right? And have all these epiphanies, understandings, and then the ceremony ends. Maybe they get some psychological guidance, that type of stuff. But the actual integration from a spiritual standpoint, the realignment doesn't occur. So the purpose of opening and removing that protection is so that everything that was held in that rigid identity can transform, right? And so if we are opening not under the volition of our own will, right, not through moment by moment choice, but through a drug, this leaves many opportunities for people to be taken advantage of. It also often robs the person of the ability to choose to close again. If you don't choose the opening, then you don't choose the integration. So because we're open, then once you're at that point, someone with skill would bring in higher functioning spiritual energy, light, information, consciousness that would realign the person and then reintegrate the person into that new alignment. And this is very much often missing. So the people who tend to be able to do a lot of drug ceremonies and these forced inductions into the openness, who are able to do that a little bit more safely from what I've seen, seem to be the ones who, one, work out a lot, like are strong. When you lift up a heavy weight, it forces you to integrate again, for everything to come slamming back together. So people who work out a lot and in conjunction with that have some type of physical practice that puts them in all kinds of positions and works their balance and that kind of function. And, that's something really, really to consider if you're going to be forcing through external stimulus the opening of these systems. The weights can be, and the exercise can be a way to close, or we could say reintegrate the mind and the body back together to find that balance, right? So the other thing that pops up in relation to drug use, especially when combined with higher level spiritual practice, is delusions of grandeur. So of people I know, the ones who have done a lot of spiritual work and will not stop talking your ear off about their personal relationship with God as the word that they use. 100% of those people have also done a lot of drugs, which is interesting. Just a correlation. I'm not saying a one for one, but it's an interesting thing. Now, as you start working and opening these clairvoyant capacities, these these spiritual sense gates and the spiritual communications, delusions of grandeur become something we have to navigate, because you'll get all kinds of information that comes through. There's all kinds of phenomena that occur behind the senses that we're typically not aware of. And as we become more aware and we're closer and closer to a present moment, we'll start to observe all of these subtle thought forms, or sense forms, we might call them. And when we observe them, we will very often, if we're getting into this space, immediately put a bunch of meaning on it. So we want to be aware, observant, and non-attached. We don't want to get stuck in the habit of deifying spiritual experience, right? We need to remain open and unattached to those experiences. They can be truly magical and life-changing, but at the end of the day, it's a thing that happened, and the transformation occurs. Typically, if we are stuck on an experience, right? If there's one that we're always talking about, I had this happen and blah, 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 and this and that, it usually means we haven't integrated it. Because once a lesson has integrated, once you can do a thing, the novelty wears off and it becomes a part of your daily life, your moment by moment experience. And that's really something to consider, right? The example I sometimes use that students laugh at is, when was the last time you applauded yourself for, like flushing the toilet or something, right? Whereas, when you were 3 and the first time you did it, your parents stood outside the door and clapped for you. But it's not something you think about, right? And the same thing it applies as you keep developing, where you integrate these understandings, these experiences, and that just becomes how you perceive and engage with the world at these higher levels of vibration and perception, right? So we want to be very wary of delusions of grandeur, and just keep the open-mindedness, keep the equanimity. Make sure you're working your equanimity practices to stay grounded and calm, right? Grounded and equanimous. Now, equanimous doesn't necessarily mean calm or what we typically would think of as grounded, right? Equanimity allows for the fluctuation. It is a space in which the identity expands and permeates to, and is very much linked to the Akasha. Okay? So Bardon warns against doing the psychedelic drugs. We want to open under the volition of our own will, and remember that will evolves in its subtlety. The will you might use in the beginning, this is one of the big pitfalls in the Hermetic students who are really focused on Hermetics, is a lot of the writing involves the word will. And so the willpower we most often think of is the will that we connect with when we're first entering the path, right? And that is a very different, more coarse, dense will than the will that you evolve to over time and that keeps evolving, right? So we want to be very careful of getting stuck on interpretations, beginner level interpretations of what the word will could mean. So train, practice, evolve, learn how to open yourself volitionally and reintegrate volitionally. This will help you maintain your sovereignty as a spiritual entity and, person walking the path. And this will allow you to find much grander unity over time, right? We never want to subjugate ourselves. We need to allow for the open-minded, free growth and integration in a constant flux again and again and again and again. Okay, so just a few small thoughts on that, and take it as you will. Like I said, there is for some people a tremendous amount of value in some of these ceremonies, but there's the often not talked about downsides as well. So weigh those, and just trust yourself. And if you trust yourself and it leads you down a path that you don't like, well, good lesson. All right, that's it for that. I think we will discuss the elementaries, the physical training, in the next episode of the podcast, and we'll make that a part 2, because there's a fair bit to look at there. Okay, thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed this. And once again, if you're interested in training in person, I have a 16-day level 1 and 2 spiritual initiation retreat coming up in June. This will be in Powell River, British Columbia, 2025. And if you can't make that, we have online courses you can check out on the website here. Also, I teach private lessons. I do private coaching via video online, and those sessions are 2 hours in length, so you can hit me up if you're interested in that as well. All right, thanks a lot. Bye.